All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is our sixth installment of our Oregon Wine Month education webinars, and we're excited to jump into it here in just a second. We're going to let a few more people join the room before we start talking about the northern borders. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. This has been great. We've got some exciting news to share, which we'll get to in a second. But again, we'll just let the room fill up here just a little bit more. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm David DeWitt. I'm Trade Relations Manager for the Oregon Wine Board. And as I mentioned, this is our sixth webinar supporting Oregon Wine Month. And we're excited to talk about one of my favorite regions for a number of reasons, recreation and also the great wines. And hello from Arizona. Glad to have you with us. We're going to be talking about the Columbia Gorge and the Walla Walla AVA. Pretty exciting region. Lots of different wines coming from here, and certainly one of the most beautiful places in Oregon. As everybody probably knows by now, our devices are muted. We will be using the chat primarily for any questions that come up. We'll also be taking a look at the Q&A, and we certainly encourage questions. We love answering them in real time. This webinar will be recorded, and we will post the recording here to this website. And also, if there's some information that you see that you would like to have or source, a lot of it can be found in our resource studio. Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that the Oregon Wine Board's new consumer website has just been completed, and we're really excited about it. There's a lot of information in there for consumers if you're thinking about planning a trip to Oregon. There's information about events that will be happening throughout the month. To support Oregon Wine Month, there's even a contest, an enter to win a trip to Oregon wine country, which is pretty exciting, and that can be found there. I'm going to drop a link to the website in here in just a second. And then additionally, just because of all the participation and excitement about the webinar series, we've decided to add another one. So on May 23rd, we will be hosting another webinar. Again, it's Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific time, in 2 weeks from today, where we'll be focusing on sustainability and farming practices, which is really important. Oregon is certainly a pioneer when it comes to sustainability, and we wanted to shed some light on that. So I will also provide a link for registration here shortly. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bree Stock, our Director of Education for the Oregon Wine Board and MW. Bree, you've been doing a great job. I know this is a lot of fun for us, and this is our sixth webinar. So keep up the good work. Thank you, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. Happy to be back with everyone today. Our sixth webinar. We're going to explore the northern borders of Oregon's AVAs. As you can see in this next map, Oregon has 22 unique AVAs, and we have 4 shared cross-border AVAs. We're going to be talking about 3 of those today, which are based along the northern part of Oregon. You can see that we brush up to Washington on the northern border there. And the Columbia River, the US's 4th largest river system, is what divides Washington and Oregon. And we share a couple of cross-border AVAs with Washington. Columbia Gorge AVA in the west, the Columbia Valley AVA, the very large number 19 on there, and the number 20 Walla Walla Valley AVA, which isn't on the Columbia River, but nevertheless is still a shared AVA with Washington. So I'm excited to dive into this really beautiful, distinctive region that's really based around a much different soils and much different climate than many that we've discussed in the program so far. So Walla Walla Valley is a relatively established AVA. It has well over 200 producers. It's one of the growing regions that are some of the warmest in Oregon. So as you can see from this little graph here, temperatures reach up into the high 90s during the growing season from June to September. But it's a region that has fairly low rainfall, and so can have less than 12 inches of rainfall annually. And what that means is that there's irrigation that's required in many of the AVA areas, but also combined with those hot summers and dry growing season, it means that we can really ripen very full-bodied, thick-skinned grape varieties in this AVA. It's located right up against the Blue Mountains in the valley, and that I'll get to that a little bit later, but it gives it a really distinctive vineyard profile. So just a reminder that Oregon is situated on the Ring of Fire. So most of the volcanic vineyards, regions on the West Coast are volcanic vineyards. So you can see that there. It can be a pretty unstable area, but that's also how our magnificent soils have been formed as well. And what makes the diversity of soils so interesting is because of that continued flexing of the tectonic plates and the geological history of this region. So while basalt is a fairly typical soil type in the north of Oregon, we have a lot more loess, windblown loess here in Walla Walla, and then also a lot deeper depth of Missoula flood slack water sediments. We're going to dive in a little bit to how these soils were formed. So tectonic plates are shifting. As you know, Oregon and Washington sit on the North American plate and the Juan de Fuca plate. So we're always waiting for that next collision of those plates to, destabilize a little more soil. So a lot of uplifted volcanic activity and marine sediments coming from that collision of these soils. And you can really see that in the AVAs of the Columbia Gorge and Columbia Valley. And we'll show those pictures soon. But those plates smash together. The Cascade Mountain Range forms inland above the water and is a lot of volcanic rock formation and volcanic activity. So Oregon forms enough landmass to be out of the water, and here is really where our geology story begins. So those cascades and the volcanoes in Washington and Idaho and Montana are really active about 16 to 14 million years ago. And what this creates is intense lava flows. And it's one of the reasons that viticulture is able to be done so successfully and growing is to be done so successfully on the eastern side of the Cascades in Washington and in this northern border AVA is because of this layering of these massive volcanic eruptions for nearly 2 million years that sent lava flows down the Columbia River, opened up into the Pacific Ocean, and really weighed down a lot of the soil in this area. So the eastern side of the Cascades, with all of that volcanic layering, lava layering, weighed down the soils there enough to get them to a lower elevation than a lot of the other eastern side of the Cascade Range in Oregon. So it's pretty unique in Washington to have these basalt bedrock soils. And then 2.5 million years ago, the Ice Age begins, and here is an image. So this Cordilleran ice sheet, the Ice Age, spreads from Canada across Montana, Idaho, and is really what starts to carve this very special region. So the Cordilleran ice sheet there 18 to 15,000 years ago, begins to melt and starts to release water. And so, like, when an ice cube is melting in your cocktail, the water levels rise, and that ice cube is floated, and it can get pushed down into the flow of those past lava flows. So those past lava flows really created and carved the Columbia River Gorge and the northern part of the Willamette Valley and the Walla Walla area. And then this flooding continues about every 50 years. So it was relatively consistent for every 50 years there would be a massive water wall and a great big flood of water as it was released into the Columbia River Gorge. And this ice is pushed through the Columbia River Gorge and leaves these slack water deposits. You can see on that image there just how much carving and scraping of frozen ice along with water was pushed down the Wallula Gap and into the Columbia River. So the Wallula Gap was really that bottleneck for the Columbia River, where things would get backed up and then the water would rise behind that and then flood the entire surrounding area, so creating Lake Wallula and then creating a series of river systems out to Walla Walla and Milton-Freewater district. So that's the very edges of the Missoula flood slack water sediments and deposits. And as you know, with the smaller sediments are going to sink, stay at the top, and the heavier sediments are going to fall to the bottom. And so we have a lot of these slack water sediments that are just on the edges of the Walla Walla AVA and creating the Milton-Freewater AVA. So a lot of very unique soil formations. And what that means is that the grapevines here are able to dig very deep into this thick, loess and sedimentary soil. So all of these alluvial sediments are layering, and then below all of that is the basalt bedrock. So the vines have a very deep series of alluvial sediments and slack water sediments to dig their roots into, to dig deeper for that basalt bedrock. And then as these water series begin to dry up, what's left behind is those much heavier deposits of gravels and cobbles that form along the riverbeds. So a lot of Walla Walla and Milton-Freewater are dried up riverbeds. And so you have that deep layering of slack water sediments, and then the heavy gravels and cobblestone deposits sitting on top of those. And so Walla Walla and Milton-Freewater are some of the only areas in Oregon that you see these deep cobblestone soils because of the flowing away of the water in this area. And that really helps the grape growing here in such a short growing season. These cobblestone soils are really useful for warming up the soil. They're useful for stopping evaporation of water from the soils as well. And then you continue to also get that reflected heat back onto the vines during the evening as well. So you can see this pretty complex series of creeks and rivers that carve through Walla Walla, creating these lovely rolling hills and river valleys. And the Blue Mountains to the east of Milton-Freewater and Walla Walla create sort of a horseshoe-shaped high amphitheater where winds that come down the Columbia River Gorge smash into those Blue Mountains and push back through the AVA, creating a lot of wind and air movement and preventing frost in this AVA. So a lot of natural climatic diversity in this area, really helping to create a cooling environment and a wind movement environment for this AVA. So these basalt cobblestone gravels, this is what they look like. We've got a picture coming up of one in some of the vineyards as well. But these Columbia River basalt rocks were eroded from the Blue Mountains and were carried by these river systems down into the basins of these old riverbeds where there are now vines planted. And previous to that, a lot of orchards planted as well. So they're about 200 to 300 feet in depth, and they really do help to warm up the soil early in the season, giving those areas that have these cobblestone gravels a little advance or getting ahead of warming up and starting the growing season and ripening process, the physiological development of the vine in this area, which is really important in a region that has a fairly cool climate for the majority of the year, and means that the growing season is pretty short and hot. So these cobbles are very important for that, and also for drainage. Then on top of the gravels and cobblestone soils, you get these winds that sort of push and pull from the east and west, but they blow in from the Pacific and are funneled through the Columbia River Gorge and push right into the southwestern side of the Walla Walla AVA, blowing right across Milton-Freewater and pushing up against the Blue Mountains in that area. And in this area, you can actually see the trees are, grown, blowing in one direction. That's how consistent the wind is in the afternoon coming down this Columbia River. It's not necessarily a cold wind, because by the time it gets to Walla Walla, it's quite far from the Pacific Ocean, which is a cold ocean, and so you typically get pretty cold ocean currents. But by the time you get to the winds out to Milton-Freewater and to Walla Walla, they're a pretty dry wind formation and pretty warm wind formation. And so early in the growing season, this is really helpful for helping to dry out the vines and drying up any humidity that's left. But at the end of the season, can also give a little more thickening of the skins and also a little dehydration as well. On top, so what's taken with these winds is this loess soil. So these really weathered windblown soils are from the glacial erosion of the granite bedrock. They really blanket all of these slack water sediments into the Walla Walla Valley, and that Columbia River basalt is below it as well. So it allows for a lot of very controlled irrigation. It can bring vine stress, but it allows you to really control, if you have that irrigation and deep loess soils, you're able to control your vine ripening and practice deficit irrigation in these areas. These loess soils are incredibly fine and powdery. They're almost like talcum powder. And so when they are wet, they get very much like a clay and a sticky clay. And then when they dry out, you can see how they crack there. But it allows the vine roots to go deep below them as well. So, and then also that cracking also helps protect the water that's maybe beneath those low soils as well. So it's why we don't need to use very much water when we're farming grapes in this AVA. There's an image of the Walla Walla Vintners, Yellowbird Vineyard, and then Amory Cellars in the back there. But as you can see, most of the vineyards here are on the valley floor or on the lower elevations. And traditionally, this region has been a high agricultural region for a lot of wheat crops and farming. Obviously, the famous Walla Walla onions are grown here as well. And also a lot of orchard fruits. So this has always been a very very deep-rooted agricultural community, and it's still very much a deep farming community, with a lot of these farmers having multiple generations of family in this area and coming to grape growing within the last 50 or 60 years. So a pretty exciting area for the continued development of deep agriculture in this area. So this is the outline. Walla Walla AVA was established in 1984. It became Washington's second AVA and Oregon's second AVA as well. And so this AVA is and was also the first cross-border AVA, and then the Columbia Valley followed. So it's a fairly large AVA, but not as large certainly as something like the Willamette Valley or Southern Oregon AVAs. But the vineyard plantings are continuing to expand, and it's one of the fastest growing AVAs in both Washington and Oregon. So planted acreage is around 1,200 acres. And then the major grape varieties are really, again, those Bordeaux and Syrah varieties, primarily Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, but Syrah is one of the fastest growing grape varieties in this area as well for vineyard plantings. So a lot more interest in some of these Rhone varieties. So you can see the split of the varietal makeup here in Walla Walla. 38% Cabernet Sauvignon and 18% Merlot. And the Bordeaux blends made in this AVA are some of the most elegant, but also most powerful as well. So there's a very good balance here of ripe fruit along with ripe tannin structure. And the Merlot here doesn't tend to be quite as fleshy and jammy as it can be in California. In fact, because of the winds in Walla Walla and those very poor soils that the vines have to really struggle to establish themselves in, Merlot is a very tiny berried, thick-skinned variety in the Walla Walla Valley, and it can actually mirror Cabernet Sauvignon here a lot more. And so Merlot may be planted at higher elevations and cooler pockets because it will definitely get ripeness, but it will also have a lot of thick tannins and structured tannins as well. So Syrah is coming in third place in terms of varieties planted, but it's really taking off in the Rocks district of Milton-Freewater, which is the nested AVA within the Walla Walla Valley. And so a lot of interest coming in for Syrah, which makes a very intriguing style of wine in the Rocks district of Milton-Freewater. There's a number of producers that are playing around with Syrah and some other Iberian varieties like Tempranillo and Grenache up in the higher elevations of the Blue Mountains. So in the higher elevations of the Blue Mountains, you're not as reliant on irrigation water because of the way it sort of is creating a rain shadow for the other side of the border into Boise and Idaho. And so you get a lot more natural water falling on the western side of the Blue Mountains. And at those higher elevations, Syrah, Cabernet Franc, Grenache, and Merlot can all be grown without the addition of irrigation. Also, many of the vines in Walla Walla and the Rocks district of Milton-Freewater are planted on their own roots. So they're not grafted vines. So to give you some history of Walla Walla, in 1859, there was the first vine nursery to be recorded, and a lot of Italian immigrants settled in this area. They planted vines and orchard fruits and were really successful in creating a local wine scene for travelers that were heading through Walla Walla on the Oregon Trail and also heading to the gold fields of Idaho. So for travelers coming from San Francisco and heading up to Idaho. But then in 1883, a very severe frost killed a lot of the vinifera vines in the Walla Walla Valley, and then other crops were planted in their place. So this was when we started to see a lot more wheat, a lot more orchard fruits and fruit trees being planted. And then in 1917, prohibition ends and a lot of the remaining commercial production is shut down. And so then late 1930s, when prohibition is repealed, it is a very small region for vines at that point. It's not until 1974 when Gary Figgins plants Leonetti Vineyard, which returns vine growing for a commercial stance into the Walla Walla Valley. And Figgins family are still very present in the Walla Walla Valley and are expanding their vineyard production. And there's some of them pioneering winemakers and grape growers moving up into the Blue Mountains and really exploring the upper heights of what is possible in the Walla Walla Valley, and exploring the more moderate regions for grape growing. Okay, good. Just doing a quick check-in on the chat here. And then the 1980s saw a lot of investment into Walla Walla, with Woodward Canyon, Lacole, Waterbrook, and Seven Hills being founded, and starting the Walla Walla wine industry, and creating that first Walla Walla AVA. And then here's another image of Blue Mountain Estate Vineyard, and you can see, looking across at the hills, you can see all of this grass farming or wheat farming right next to the vineyard. So this continues to be a mixed agricultural landscape. You can also see here how high the vines are trained off the ground to allow for air movement and to protect from frost. Now, the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater is the newest AVA in the region, and it was created in 2015. And it was created around these free-water series of cobbles. And it's a very distinctive soil type within the region. And it's the only AVA to be founded and formed around a soil series. So it's not as AVAs are typical in the US, in that it's usually a named place or named around a water district. And this is actually named around that free water series of soils. So you can see that the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater is encompassed entirely on the Oregon side of the Walla Walla Valley. It's a very small AVA. It's Oregon's second smallest AVA, but it's growing rapidly. So there's 330 acres planted, but within the next couple of years, that will have tripled. There's a lot of interest in Syrah that's being grown in the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater. And the Syrah and Cabernet that's grown here is incredibly distinctive. In 1997, it was Christophe Baron at Cayuse Vineyards who first planted the first modern day vineyard in the Rocks District, believing that those cobbles were so incredibly similar to regions in his homeland of Châteauneuf-du-Pape that he focused on planting Syrah and Grenache and other Rhone varieties at his vineyard property on the Rocks District. Following Christophe and Cayuse, Tom Walliser plants more fruit and makes it available to the larger marketplace, and really starts to begin the conversation about Rocks District wine. It's been recognized by many wine critics as well, with several 100-point score wines. And then in 2006, the plantings are really increasing, and a lot of the old orchards and old orchards in this area are being replaced by vines on these cobblestone soils. Steve Robertson of SJR Vineyard, the vineyard that you just saw before that, was one of the first to begin spearheading a movement to establish the Rocks District, the Milton-Freewater series Rocks District AVA. And he approached Kevin Pogue, who is a soil scientist in Washington, and hired Kevin to outline the distinctive soils that Stephen had been observing in the region, and really wanted to carve those out as being completely different from the surrounding area. So a lot less loess and basalt here, a lot more silt and a lot more cobbles. And the distinctive wines that were being made off of these cobblestone soils led to that continued work on developing this AVA. It was in 2015 that the TTB then granted the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater AVA status. And they currently continue to grow and expand this AVA, and they continue to have a Rhone Rangers celebration to celebrate all of the beautiful Syrahs that are made off of these properties. So those cobbles are incredibly important in terms of helping to warm up the soil, get the vines motivated early in their life, and start to begin that physiological lifespan for the growing season. They radiate a lot of heat back onto the bunches and clusters of grapes in the area. And you can see here that the vines are trained relatively low in comparison to some of those other vineyards where the vines were trained much higher. And the reason for that is so that these thick-skinned Syrah grapes can really benefit from this reflected heat and radiating heat off of those cobbles. Victoria, I believe the Rhone Rangers celebration was just held. I think it was held in Paso Robles this year. So I think it was just a couple of weeks ago. So in April and May, look for those Rhone Rangers celebrations. Because of the past farming history in the Rocks District of Milton-Freewater, there was a lot of nitrogen held in the soil. So the vines can be quite vigorous here, but this additional nitrogen and the ripening formation also contributes to creating a very meaty and fleshy style of Syrah. So it's very deep Kalamata olive, very meaty, and incredibly perfumed and exotic flavors of Syrah that are continuing to get recognized around the world. So for this reason, a lot of the vineyards that are now being planted in the Rocks District are being planted towards Syrah. So moving from the Walla Walla area, which is in the east of that cross-border AVA chain, moving into the Columbia Gorge. So Walla Walla sitting in the far east, and then we have a very large Columbia Valley AVA, which is not as populated as the Columbia Valley AVA of Washington is. So in Washington, the Columbia Valley AVA really holds the majority of Washington's nested AVAs, but in Oregon, it's a standalone AVA that just encompasses Walla Walla Valley and brushes up against the Columbia Gorge. So the Columbia Gorge AVA is an AVA unto itself, brushing up against the Columbia Valley AVA. On the very far western side of the Columbia Valley AVA, there are a number of vineyards that are starting to be planted in the Dalles area and on the distinctive sedimentary and low soils in that area there. So the Columbia Gorge AVA is incredibly dynamic in terms of both its climate, its soils, and the grape varieties that are grown. And as you move from west to east, very cool in the west, and a lot of rainfall and more suited to Burgundian and Alsatian varieties. And then as you start to progress to the east, you start to move into the drier, as you're starting to cross ridge lines of the Cascades and move into much drier, warmer weather conditions in this area. So the majority of the Columbia Gorge AVA is located on the Oregon side of the border. It's a relatively small AVA at just 120,000 acres. You can explore it in just a weekend, although plantings here are still increasing and producers are increasing. It's quite close to Portland, so just over an hour outside of Portland, not too dissimilar to the northern parts of the Willamette Valley. And it is also a very large sporting community. So the Columbia River here, the winds travel through this valley at incredibly high speeds. And it's one of the windsurfing and kite surfing capitals of the world. So a lot of leisure travel here, fantastic mountain biking, fantastic hiking. There's hundreds of waterfalls, and it's also a very large brewing community as well. So you can see here just how much the precipitation changes and alters as you get closer, as you move to the east. So you're still getting much more similar to the Coast Range rainfall on the east, on the western side of the AVA, and then as you move to the east, you're drying out and moving into a semi-arid climate here, same as Walla Walla. So it is very possible for you to grow up to 80 different grape varieties in this area, of different styles and different ripening levels. And the Columbia Gorge AVA holds some of the oldest Zinfandel in the country at this point as well. So again, as you can see, a lot more rainfall and a lot cooler temperatures during the cool winter months. Skiing and snow is common every year. And then during the summer season, as with most other places in Oregon, we get very little rainfall. So very clear blue skies that really help to dry out the vineyards and allow for complete and full ripening. However, because we're planted at various elevation levels, we're also getting a lot more access to different vineyard aspects and cooler climates. So as you go higher into the elevations and some of the deeper, more sheltered valleys, you can get very Burgundian styles of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, very crisp aromatic whites, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, quite exotic aromatic white varieties. And then as you move to the east, you again start to move into more of those Iberian varieties where there's Menthea planted and Grenache and Zinfandel and Tempranillo. And Tannat, and all of great range of varieties being planted as you move further east, where you're getting a very dry, warm landscape with deep soils. This is an image of the Columbia Gorge AVA from the Oregon side, looking up the valley, up the river valley. So this is very much, you can see all of the conifers and the deciduous plants. You can see how green and lush it is on this western end. And it's just on the other side of this ridgeline where you start to have some of the more cool climate styles of wine being grown and made in the Columbia Gorge AVA. So that wind, as we discussed a little earlier in Walla Walla, is even more present here in the Columbia Gorge. So it funnels from the Pacific Ocean into the Columbia Gorge, it brings with it a lot of Pacific Ocean storms that hit that western side of the Cascade Range and continue to blow down the Columbia River Gorge. These winds are funneled through there and will create winds that are in excess of 50 miles an hour down that Columbia River Gorge. So it's very important here to have sheltering for your vines so that they don't get their leaves completely stripped or their stomatas shutting down because of the strong winds. So on that western side, you'll often find the vines being planted on south and east facing, west facing slopes. And then as you start to move towards the east, you start to get more exposure and being able to plant around the entire aspect of the vineyard. And this is from the western side of the Columbia Gorge. You can see the vines here are on very rocky, loess soil, so rocky volcanic basalt, and then loess and mudstone on top of the volcanic basalt. So this this vineyard is at the eastern end of the AVA and looks across at the Dalles. So you can see how arid this environment is and this climate is from what we were just looking at before, which lends itself to a completely different array of grape varieties being grown and different styles of wine being made. You can definitely really explore the Rhone varieties, the ripe Iberian varieties, and obviously Bordeaux varieties as well, once you get onto this warmer eastern plateau. So a lot more diversity in the soils here in the Columbia Gorge because of the very dramatic geological history that's been in this area. So you get the volcanic basalts, the degraded Columbia River basalts, the Cascade mountain stream sediments, as you get in Walla Walla as well. And then you get Underwood Mountain basalt, which is an volcano that was active very recently just on the northern side of the AVA. These lahars are lava river flows from these erupting volcanics. So when Underwood Mountain erupted, these the lava flows formed into lahars, and so it's quite it's a different type of volcanic soil caused by different levels of temperature as it cooled. Then you have the loess soils, those wind-blown loess soils that are mostly on the northern and eastern aspects of the AVA. And then, of course, these fast slack water deposits from the Missoula floods and from those repeated flood cycles that happened millions of years ago. So 10 to 5 million years ago, the Dalles Formation was formed, which is formed from the erosion of the Cascade Mountain Range, which brought a lot of volcanic stream sediments into the Dalles and really exposed some of these basalt peaks or columns that you can see in the image here. So they exposed a lot more in the Dalles. In this area, there's a lot more exposed basalt rock from that degradation of these soils. So the volcanic soils are those Cascade mountain stream sediments produced from that weathering of the Cascades. It's incredibly old, low nutrient soil with a very low pH, and it's capable of stressing the vines quite a bit. That allows them to control their vigor, but also have continued ripening, successful ripening. And then again, the Ice Age, so very similar history to Walla Walla, but what's different is that the activity of the volcanoes in this area are much more recent. And so Mount Defiance and Underwood Mountain were really volcanoes that have been quite young and continue to have activity. And this is where the lahars are formed. So the lava and volcanic fragments are spewing out, covering the landscape and the entire Columbia Gorge AVA, and these are the youngest soils in the region, which means that they also are quite nutrient rich. So Underwood Mountain basalt from the eruption of Underwood Mountain, high elevations helps to restrain the vine vigor, along with the cooling, cool elevations. So this is where you end up having a lot of Alsatian and cool climate varieties, aromatic varieties that are capable of being ripened at these higher elevations, 600 plus feet high, very high in acidity, very bright aromatic flavor profile as well. So this is the lahars that formed in these mountain stream sediments. So carving out these vineyards, and there's quite a few on lahar soils, low nutrients, and in those deep valley areas. So a lot of shading and shadowing happening in those lahar areas. And then of course you get the windblown silt from the floodplains onto the surrounding slopes. Again, just a very active climate in this area. So weathered, windblown, low soils, they're very fine, very free draining. They quite low in nutrients, but they do help to retain some water as well. And then the Missoula floods occur, filling up that Columbia River, blocking it up, carving out even more exposed basalt with the Missoula floods, and bringing with it layers of alluvial sediment as well. So slackwater sediments are found along the Columbia Gorge as well. It just depends on how fast moving and how heavy the sediments were. But as the bathtub sort of fills up, it gets blocked, and you get these layers of bathtub sort of silt that you can see in that image there, in that slackwater deposit. So you can see how many times in a row that region has flooded, and then the water has receded, and then floods again, and the water recedes. And so you get a very complex landscape of different ages of soil here. Fast water sediments, like what you find in Milton-Freewater, is these cobbles and boulders and rock soils, mostly found at the lower elevations, like here at Memaloose on the Oregon side of the AVA. This is at the end of harvest. This is head trained Chenin Blanc and Gamay Noir vines, and you can see just how rocky these soils are, but also iron rich. You can see that deep brown, that deep red brown soil, giving a little more nutrients in this side of the AVA, as compared to the northern side, which is a lot more arid, crossing the Columbia River. So slackwater sediments layered with sand on the bottom and silt on the top. Sand is obviously larger particle size. Vineyards on here are generally the further east vineyards. So this is one of the more westerly vineyards. You can see the comparison, the difference between the landscape here to this very western vineyard, and the deciduous trees and the amount of rainfall that it receives. That's Mount Hood in the background there. So this is on the northern slopes of Mount Hood. The history of the Columbia Gorge wine region in the 1880s, families set up here in White Salmon on the Washington side of the border, and planted the first grapes. And then it wasn't really until after Prohibition when grapes came back again. Oops. So Prohibition again, receded the industry. 1970s, Solilo Vineyard, which you can see on the bottom there, started planting Lemberger, which is Blaufränkisch, and a series of other varieties. And then in 1982, there was an old Zinfandel vineyard that was found by Lonnie Wright of the Pines, and that was planted in the 1850s. And so this was really resurrecting that old vineyard site to reclaim that historic area. There are more than 90 vineyards in the Columbia Gorge today, and more than 50 wineries exist, most of them under 5,000 cases. Good question, Manuel. The wine laws are different on each side of the border, simply because Oregon has slightly stricter AVA regulations. So if you're making the wine from Oregon grapes and on the Oregon side of the border, you must adhere to those higher percentages for varietal and place restrictions. However, if you are making wine on the Washington side, if you're on the Oregon side as a winery and purchase fruit from the Washington side, you can label that as Washington, but you can't do the same if you're going across on the other side of the border. So if you're making your wine in Washington, but you're purchasing it from Oregon vineyards outside of the Columbia Gorge AVA, you can only call it Oregon wine. So slightly different restrictions in place there, but pretty similar. Washington is fairly strict as well. It's a little stricter than California, but most of the wineries are located on the Oregon side. You can see in this bottom image here just how much usable land there is on the Washington side. So the Washington side of the AVA is a very thin, narrow corridor. And then there are some vineyards higher up in the hills, but generally the cities, White Salmon is probably the largest city on that side of the river. And there's just a couple of breweries and a couple of small wineries as well, who source from their vineyards up in the hillsides. So it's a pretty dynamic little area and well worth the visit, making really exciting wines from a lot of different varieties. There's, Arnais, Gadeo, there's a lot of different varieties planted in this AVA. And then, so this is just a little overview. So that transition of the climate from very maritime on the western end to much more continental and arid on the eastern end, which is happening in just a very short area of about 40 miles. So you can really cover the AVA quite quickly, but really explore a variety of grape varieties and sort of travel the world of wine just within that one area. And so people are, not relying on a single grape variety to make all of their wine from, and instead embracing exactly what can be grown across this entire AVA. So making it very, very, very exciting and a very fun area to visit and drink in. Just another vineyard on the Oregon side, Ziegler Vineyard, and this is at the as we're starting to transition to the eastern end of the valley. So that covers all of the Columbia Gorge and the Walla Walla Valley AVAs. Thanks for everyone for being here again. And if you're able to visit the area, I know not a lot of producers from the Columbia Gorge or Walla Walla actually have distribution, but they have fantastic tasting rooms and are very welcoming and an exciting place to visit, where you don't just taste wine, you can travel and hike and mountain bike and ski and do all of the things all year round. It's a pretty exciting area to be. So highly recommend you go and visit. It's a bit of a drive to get from one to the other, from one end of Walla Walla down to the Columbia Gorge. But, you know, if you had a week, it would be a great little week's road trip to do Walla Walla, Milton-Freewater, and then come back through the Columbia Valley and then into the Columbia Gorge AVA and end up in Portland and visit some of those Portland urban wineries. So thanks everyone for being here. We're going to take a break next week from the webinar series, but I believe David has the link for registering for the next webinar. David, I'll let you kick it off from here.
Great, thanks, Bree. Great job again, and thank you everybody for showing up. This has been a pleasure to host these. I did put the link for next week's for the webinar we're doing in 2 weeks. It's at the top of the chat if you want to register. It'll also be on our trade events page where we host the recordings. So I encourage you to visit that as well and share it. Thank you again for everybody for participating, and enjoy the week off, and we'll be back here in 2 weeks.